Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Conversion Therapy and You. And this week, we're looking at the Change or Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition Bill of 2020 that has come into existence in 3 Australian territories. And it's a real joy, once again, for me to welcome back Dr. Laura Haynes. Very good to see you, Laura.
Good to see you, Mike.
Have you had a good 2 weeks?
Yeah, well, in the U.S., no news has been good news on our Equality Act, which is our version of a federal attempt to ban change-allowing therapy for sexual orientation and gender identity. It remains stuck in the Senate, and that's fine with us.
Well, I'm looking forward to some more discussion with you because I think it's going to be really interesting to make comparisons between the different countries. Last week, we looked at Bill, C6 in Canada. We've looked at the Equalities Bill as it's making progress in the USA. And today, we're seeing the Change or Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition Bill. Now, it's a joy for me tonight to briefly introduce to you James Parker. James, are you there? You are there.
Now, I am very much here with you, Mike, tonight, yes.
At what, 1:30, 2 a.m.?
It's something like that. It's certainly the early hours of the morning. That's all I can say. It's very much dark outside. And bizarrely, the wind is whistling here in Australia. Wow. And in Western Australia, we don't get a lot of whistling wind in the night, sure, but it's good to be with you here today.
Well, maybe the wind is signaling something. We need a good wind, that's for sure. So you're very welcome, James. We're going to watch something about your life, and I hope, friends at home, you'll be as moved as I always am when I listen to James's story. We're going to get into it in detail towards the end of the program, but just for a few minutes, take a look at James Parker and how things have worked in his life so far.
For many years, a gay activist and in a long-term gay relationship. And he took me on this just incredible journey of recovery through intimacy and prayer and that one-to-one relationship with him. I came out as gay to my mum and dad when I was age 17. You know, they were amazing. They told me they loved me. They told me that they accepted me. I felt an inner freedom inside at that time that was really palpable. And I felt that way because I'd always been sexually attracted to other men for as long as I could remember. I mean, it was 100% of a same-sex attraction. I'd always believed that I was born to be homosexual. And I began to fight for lesbians and for gays, because at that time, there was only really lesbian and gays. There was no LGBTQIAAP plus 2S community. It was just lesbians and gays. And I fought for us to be wholly accepted. And again, for the churches, all the churches, to change their teachings about homosexuality. I also tried to sort of fight for laws to be made to be able to reflect equal rights across the board for people who experience same-sex attraction. Now, I was very promiscuous for a time. Everybody on the gay scene was. And a friend of mine, a fellow student at university, a guy who was renowned for being a man of prayer, and he asked me the question, he said to me, James, do you want more love in your life? I thought, well, stupid question. I mean, of course I responded, well, yes. And that actually led him to inviting me to a series of evenings called Life in the Spirit seminars. And the same guy who invited me to the seminars, he began to intentionally disciple me, to begin to walk this journey with Christ and to help me to be formed. Within 6 weeks, I'd actually learned to be still for 8 minutes a day. I remember it from my watch. And other people, and particularly my boyfriend, Steve, they began to notice the change in me. In fact, Steve noticed the change so much that he said to the group, I said, yeah, you come along as well. He too made a prayer of repentance. You got this committed gay couple, both making a prayer of repentance, and he got deeply and powerfully touched by God's Spirit. And you know what's amazing is no one ever spoke to us about sexuality. all they ever did was say, move towards Jesus, make Jesus your focus, come to Jesus. It was probably within just a number of months that I began to feel this incredible discomfort with what was happening sexually between me and Steve. So the more I prayed, I began to feel the Holy Spirit almost sort of drawing this line within the sand, almost saying it's time now to make some choices, to the point that I realized I have to end this relationship. And just through some great therapy, I just had this amazing Christian therapist who just understood what he was doing. He understood the journey of the soul. What's amazing is there's a lot of people who said to me, oh, did you pray that God would make you straight? And I said, look, I've never prayed that prayer, and I wouldn't pray that prayer. And I partly didn't pray it because I didn't even believe that the thing was even possible. And it got me reflecting on what I did pray. And actually my prayer was this. My prayer was, Lord, make me into the man that you created me to be. Clearly my biology screams that I'm male. So therefore I'm like, well, make me into the man you wanted me to be. I mean, really overall, what I discovered is this, that I had a very deep mother wound and a very deep father wound. And that was as a result of my having been adopted as a very small baby. I'd actually rejected my true male identity because actually, even from birth, I'd been really quite frightened of men from that time onwards. And I came to understand too, that I'd actually been sexually abused by many men as a child, and I'd suppressed all those thoughts and reactions of that. That led me to being pulled towards depravity rather than moving towards my God-given dignity. There's also the fact that different lesbian and gay groups, they'd named me as gay and told me that I was gay, and I took on that label. And they encouraged me to take on that identity of my sexual attraction, that somehow that's all my identity was, my sexual attraction. And the Lord showed me I was much more than that. Amazingly, what I experienced for the first time was this strong sense of masculinity and a strong sense of acceptance by other men. And what shocked me most of all, here I'm in my late 20s now, and my voice is suddenly becoming deeper. And my walk, my very gait, and even my posture itself is changing. My head is going up, my shoulders are back, and I'm feeling much, much more like a man. What's amazing still is I actually ended up dating women. I ended up getting married to a woman, and I became a father. And today, I'm really honored to be able to help people to find and to enter into that God-given identity, to help people to recover from all sorts of addictions, particularly sex addiction and porn addiction, and to help people also to heal from childhood trauma, and of course, especially childhood sexual abuse.
What a blessing to hear that again. That's our James, and Australia may have him at the moment, but as far as I'm concerned, he's still our James, and he still has his roots in the UK. I'm not sure if he'd agree, but it's a blessing to listen to that once again. Folks, it's time now to just spend a few minutes in the ancient world. Some of you will know from previous episodes that I've been undertaking a journey in terms of looking at the Vesuvian towns in Italy. And last week, we showed the introduction to listening to the silence. And this week, we're going one step further. You remember we looked for a bird's eye view of this amazing city. And we began to talk about what it can teach us, what the ancients can teach the moderns. But today, I want to go one step further and have a look at probably one of the earliest buildings in Pompeii, the Doric Temple. Take a look at this.
Situated in the 2nd century BC triangular forum, the Doric temple I'm heading for now is much older. One of the oldest buildings in Pompeii, built in the 6th century BC. Then clearly visible from the sea, this temple was built when Pompeii was under the influence of the Greeks. You can just see on the left as we round the base of the temple, a separate sacred part of the structure, the Heroon, a shrine probably dedicated to Hercules and was used to commemorate heroes and founders. But by the Roman period, the the temple was already abandoned. The Greek deities once worshipped on this site were imported from Greece, and the Romans renamed the deities to make them their own. Zeus became Jupiter, Poseidon became Neptune, and Athena Minerva, to name a few.
One of the great things about being in Pompeii is the reminder of just how cosmopolitan it really was. We can go back to the 7th century BC, apparently, when Pompeii came together as a viable place. It eventually achieved the status of being a Roman colony. Herculaneum didn't achieve that status, though strived to be in that league. But I suppose one of the secrets of Pompeii was that it managed to bring together in a melting pot all sorts of people. The Etruscans, the Samnites, the Greeks, and the Romans all had a contribution to the cultural fabric and milieu that we see in this place. The thing that's really interesting to me is the fact that these were cosmopolitan places. And one of the best ways of seeing that cosmopolitan nature is looking at the religious fabric. And where I am at the moment is the remains of a not very well preserved Doric temple, but the Greek cult was definitely a part of the fabric here.
It was into this world of Roman polytheism that Judean exclusivism found its way, seeking a peaceful coexistence. And it's in towns like these that we begin to sense the beginnings of this new faith. While the Romans were adding new deities like insurance policies to keep themselves safe, the new faith from Judea was encouraging the abandonment of deities other than the one true God. It's easy, I think, to sense the potential for conflict between the Roman world and Christian living as it was beginning to emerge all over the known world.
So the Doric temple, why Doric? Well, because it would have had very large Doric columns around it, 7 on the long side and 4 on the short side. You'll know there are Ionic and there are Doric columns. And this represents the very ancient, most ancient part of Greek architecture. So what we're saying is this is extremely ancient, folks. Did you pick that up? 6th century BC, that temple was built. And by the time of the eruption, it had been defunct for many years. But here's the point. We see in this melting pot the coming together of different values. And then all of a sudden, we have the introduction of the gospel, and these two completely different systems began to vie with one another. So join us again in 2 weeks' time as we continue the journey and go deeper into the city of Pompeii. And hopefully, as we look at the evidence and the ideology that controls how we understand the evidence, I'm hoping that will be a great learning point for us as we too have to work through ideologies. I'm going to ask Laura to come back now, and we're going to progress with the rest of the program, and specifically to talk about what has happened there. And I just wanted to read this so that I get it right here. We're going to be talking to John Steenhoff, who is principal lawyer of the Human Rights Law Alliance in Australia. He'll explain a little bit in a few minutes about exactly what that is. But what is bringing us together today is the fact that in 2020 and 2021, 3 Australian jurisdictions, that's Queensland, the Australian Capital Territory, and Victoria, passed legislation to ban the practice referred to as conversion therapy. Now, I'm hoping somebody's going to explain to me what the ACT is, because I struggle for some reason to get my head around what that is. But let's go on and deal with this. Laura, what have you picked up about the Australian law?
Well, I've been very interested in it and watching this for some time, particularly in Victoria, where the bill is so extreme that it's difficult to comprehend the freedoms that are being taken away from people, and the actual management of people's private sexual behavior. It's really difficult to wrap one's mind around. And I think John's interview will shed a lot of helpful light and insight onto that.
Laura, I don't know if you've come across this, but it's the Preventing Harm and Promoting Justice document. It's I don't know if the camera can pick that up, but it's something that you can Google and have a read of. I'm not recommending it, but what I found really interesting, and maybe James can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems as though their evidence is based on a very small population sample. I think they're talking about 15 people here, and only one of them basically seems to be talking about harm in the context of therapy. But then when I look at the survey that was done by Free to Change, they come up with, I think, 75 testimonies and stories about people leaving unwanted same-sex attraction. And I guess one of the questions I have is, clearly the Australians have done their homework. I mean, all sorts of groups over time seem to have been doing a great deal to interact with their government. But here we are with legislation that is very clearly extreme from our point of view. Anyway, I guess we'll check that out with the Australians that we're going to speak to tonight. So let's have a look at the clip. Laura, is there anything else you want to mention before we go ahead? Otherwise, we'll go into the clip. Anything?
I just think this interview with John is going to be very helpful to us.
Let's roll the clip. Thank you. John Steenhoff, thank you so much for coming this evening. You're the principal lawyer of the Human Rights Law Alliance. Tell us something about that organization.
Pleasure to be here with you today, Michael. So the Human Rights Law Alliance is an Australian not-for-profit law firm, and we are working in the area of religious freedom and in the related freedoms of thought, expression, association, and conscience. And so we have two main roles. The first one is that we act for Christians and other people of faith who have faced hostility for their faith, people who have lost their jobs, have been kicked out of university, have been excluded from the public square because of their religious beliefs, and we take their cases and run those. The other thing we do is provide advisory services and submissions on laws that are going to have dramatic effects on religious freedom. So as new laws are introduced around Australia, both federally and in each of our state jurisdictions, we will engage on those. We will give public speeches about those laws and what their implications are for religious freedom.
So you sound a little like the UK's Christian Concern or the Christian Institute. You do similar legal work, I understand it, as those groups. Have you heard of them?
We'd love to be as well-resourced and as effective as Christian Concern and Christian Institute. We're like them. We're a few years behind, but we're trying to get up to speed very quickly, Michael.
Well, we really appreciate the time that you're giving us today. John, what brings us together is what has been termed, I believe, the Change or Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition Bill of 2020. Could you bring us up to speed? Because I think something happened in Queensland, and is it the ACT? What is it? We find it so hard to get our heads around that.
This is hard from a distance to get your head around. So what late 2020 became an act in 2021. So we now have legislation, a whole spate of legislation, and its stated purpose is to ban the practice of conversion therapy. So we have a federal government which has, to this stage, stayed away from this kind of legislation. So each of the 9 states and territories have had to look at and try to pass laws of their own. And 3 of them have so far passed laws that purportedly ban the practice of conversion therapy. That is Queensland, which is in the northeast of Australia, the ACT, which is a small territory that holds our capital, Canberra, and where I'm talking to you from right now, and also the state of Victoria in the south. People may be aware of Melbourne is the big city in Victoria. So all those jurisdictions have passed laws. The laws are slightly different. The one that is the most comprehensive or draconian, if you're one who's concerned about freedoms, is the Victorian law. It is now the most extensive law anywhere in the world in its breadth and also in its application. So that is what that law is.
John, can you just outline the law? Perhaps focus on Victoria, since that's the one that I think we are particularly concerned about. Just give us the essence and anything that we need to be looking at.
Sure. Well, broadly, the law bans the practice of conversion therapy, and it provides for 2 ways that that ban is going to be implemented. The first is by making the practice of conversion therapy a criminal offence, so that anyone who practices conversion therapy and causes harm, psychological harm to someone as a result of that, can face significant jail time. Now, of course, when we talk about conversion therapy, we're talking about any practice or conduct that is attempting to change a person's sexual orientation or their gender identity. Now, the law is very clear in its ideological commitments. It decries any attempt to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. It says that people of LGBTQI orientations and identities are valued parts of the community who need to live with pride, etc., etc. And so it has put in place, firstly, a criminal ban, but also it gives powers to one of our administrative bodies, one of the human rights commissions in Victoria, to undertake investigation, to compel appearances, to require the provision of documents, and to be able to impose sanctions on anyone who they think is practicing conversion.
So, John, would I be correct then that there's an assumption here, once again, that sexual orientation is biologically based, and therefore these things are innate and immutable? That seems once again to be the assumption.
Correct. That the implication is that people are born this way, not only for sexual orientation, but for gender identity, and that a person's own subjective sense of who they are and what their sexual orientation is absolutely definitive and determinative and cannot be questioned and cannot be probed. And that has caused significant issues, because the whole reason and rationale given for the law was a series of research papers that were done where people who had had adverse experiences with treatments or with religious programs, with therapies and counseling, gave their stories about what harm they had experienced as a result of these kinds of techniques.
Am I correct? This was a population group of about 15. It was quite a small number, or am I confusing that with another group?
No, this is the study. It was called Preventing Harm, Promoting Justice.
Okay.
And it was a recruiting study that was done. Yes, you've got it in your hands, Michael. That is the study. And it went all throughout Australia, recruiting for people to tell their stories about experience with conversion therapy. And it ended up with 15 stories, none of which, well, only one of which purportedly was engaged or involved aversion therapy techniques, most of which involved religious practices. One
out of 15. I mean, that's a
1 out of 15.
That is a mighty small population sample to act on.
It is. And look, this is a very limited study and a very poor quality. And it admits that it is the only study of its kind in Australia, and it was used as the basis for the urgent passing of a law. The law went through Parliament without any sort of amendment, without any referral to a committee, and was rammed through very quickly. So it's unbelievable.
Now, I also came across in reading up on this, the Free to Change survey of LGBT peoples. And that's an incredibly well put together document. Now, what interests me is that 75 testimonies and subjects, stories, narratives are shared here, as opposed to 15. It beggars belief that this document has apparently received very little attention, or do you feel satisfied that they looked at that closely?
Look, Michael, it does beg a belief that no one was interested in hearing the stories of people who have had positive experiences of therapies and counseling where they have been able to deal with unwanted same-sex attraction, unwanted gender dysphoria, and give evidence of real, lifelong, or very, very long-lasting change and measurable improvements in the quality of their life. You see, the whole scheme of these conversion therapy laws completely denies the existence of the people who say, we've been helped. We've been helped by therapies. We've been helped by spiritual counseling. We've been helped by prayer. And those stories were absolutely ignored because it didn't fit with the ideological framework that's being used to push these laws through.
Just for time, I'm just going to pull a few specific questions out now, John, if that's okay. Could you, in a nutshell, just give us the central concern that you would have about the Victoria Bill? What is it that people should be concerned about?
Okay, well, we're going to run out of time if I talk about every single one of my concerns. But the concern about this bill is there's multiple concerns. The first is the scope of people who can be covered. It's not just limited to clinical practices. It covers those, but it goes far beyond. In fact, it reaches into the pulpits in churches. It reaches into the home and conversations that parents might have with their children. Questions were asked in Parliament about a wife who's seeking to, an example was given of a wife who is seeking to convince her husband or to support her husband to reject unwanted same-sex desires in order to keep his family together with his children. And the answer was given very clearly by those who were proponents of the bill, saying no one is able to consent to conversion therapy. And anyone who supports it is someone who is helping to suppress or change someone's sexual orientation. So it's staggering that it could reach such a broad category of people. The second thing is the incredible lack of definition. So we have some very open textured definitions of what constitutes sexual orientation. It's not just someone's stated identity, it's also the practices that go along with it. So a government sheet, a government fact sheet giving information said, question and answer style, what if I want to run a support group for people who have unwanted same-sex desires where I try to counsel celibacy? The answer from the government was very clear. You can't do that. That will be conversion therapy to counsel celibacy. So it cuts right across all of the variety of therapeutic treatments, of religious counselings, and says there's only one thing you can do, which is to affirm people's same-sex attractions and affirm their gender dysphoria. And that's the only thing that the law will allow you to do.
So the fact that our societies generally in the world contain vast numbers of mixed attraction people who are attracted in both directions, but we are currently only providing gay affirmative therapy and deliberately forcing people to go in that direction
instead of working to assist them in their goals to prioritize their heterosexual feelings, that just has no traction in this bill.
Not under these laws. Under these laws, you can't do that. And it's been the subject of vociferous criticism by peak medical bodies. A lot of the psychiatrist associations, the medical associations have said, while we support the banning of aversion therapy practices, the kinds of things that died out in the 1970s, this bill potentially criminalizes therapists, counselors, medical practitioners who are trying to evaluate the underlying causes for certain symptoms that present themselves. It won't allow proper clinical evidence-based diagnoses to happen. What it does is it legislates one approach and one approach only. And when you look at the definition of what is conversion therapy, it's very clear that there's only one thing that is considered not conversion therapy. So if you assist a person who's undergoing a gender transition to transition, that's specifically excluded. If you assist a person to affirm their gender identity, that is not a transition. If you give them voice coaching or give them surgery to align them with their identified gender, that is not transition. But anything else is fair game, particularly if it would explore these issues.
I'm surprised that going to that extent that, that this is sustainable. I mean, what is it? We just have to wait and see if this can work, or?
Well, we're in new territory. We're in new territory, and we don't know how the Act is going to be policed when it comes into force. So the Act was passed in February of 2021.
Right.
It takes effect in February 2022. Now, we don't know what public prosecutions are doing or what the departments are doing to look at enforcing the criminal laws, but we do know what the human rights commissions are doing. They're outfitting a whole office full of people to go out to investigate and to try to find people who might be engaged in this conversion therapy. They're putting together resources to educate clinical practitioners, churches, etc., on ways that they can comply with the new provisions and make sure that they don't fall afoul of this Conversion Therapy Act. And look, there are some carve-outs where the Act sort of says very vaguely that you won't be practicing conversion therapy if you are putting in place treatments that are absolutely necessary clinical treatments and recognized as being for the benefit and in accordance with generally accepted practice. But the bar of showing that something is necessary is incredibly high. And most of the practitioners that we've spoken to say that they don't get any comfort from that protection at all. Because when you're treating somebody and you're exploring what the basis is for certain expressions that they have and the psychological reasons behind it, you can never say that any treatment really is absolutely necessary. It provides cold comfort. So,
John, I just want to shift for a minute to the United Nations and to the fact that we have an international expert who is looking at SOGI issues and seems to have a considerable power or influence, let's say, across the world. Now, I noticed in this document, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was the Preventing Harm and Promoting Justice document. It seems to make the claim that all of this is established in international law. Is that accurate? Is that the truth? It seems to me that even his appointment was opposed by certainly by the Arab nations, which would be a group of 57, who were clearly against it. They voted against his appointment. There were lots of abstentions. But the claim is making that this is now international law. Can you comment on that?
Sure, Michael. Look, you should take everything you're presenting justice report with a grain of salt. There are also extensive claims that it is absolutely necessary under Australia's own domestic rights documents to enact these conversion therapy laws, and they're completely consistent with fundamental rights. We've done some analysis of that, and it's just absolutely not true. It cuts across all sorts of freedoms, including, the fundamental freedoms of thought, fundamental freedoms of religion, fundamental freedoms of self-determination for those who don't want to live out identities and follow the pathway of their desires, and the fundamental rights of parents to dictate or to be intimately involved in the direction of their children and the raising of their children in accordance with their religious principles. So the report's wrong on that, and it will be wrong on the international law as well. At international law, there are plenty of people who are advocating for the banning of these conversion therapy laws and who have made broad statements about how these conversion therapy practices are inconsistent with human rights. But most of those statements relate to what is the aversion therapy techniques. Those outdated and outmoded techniques where people would use electroshock therapy, ice baths, compulsion, etc., to try to change someone's desires. And that simply isn't what these acts target. They go far beyond that.
Well, John, thank you so much. That's been really enlightening. We could go on for a good deal longer, but I think I'm going to leave it there. It's been very valuable. Thank you very much for sight of your documents and for the work that you're doing. We're really very thankful. I believe, is it Martin Isles? Would he be a part of your organization?
So Martin Isles is the managing director of the Australian Christian Lobby. So they're a sister organization to us. They're kind of like Prince William and Prince Harry. We're related. We do our own special work. We talk together occasionally, and Harry and Prince William aren't a great example of that. We're more aligned than they are. But yeah, he's a sister organization, and they're involved in lobbying and grassroots activation of the Christian community on these political issues, making sure that truth gets spoken in the public square. We're the ones who sit sort of in a slightly less prominent position doing the legal work. So,
well, it's good to mention him. We're going to see an interview from him or one of his YouTube clips, and we're just really thankful for all that's coming out of Australia. God bless you and your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. God bless you too.
So that is the Change or Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition Bill of 2020. I believe it will be enforced early in 2022. And I guess this is the period when the rubber hits the road and we find out exactly how things are going to work. Laura, I think we should just pause and you and I just consider some of the questions that we should be asking James. Are there things that have struck you as John was speaking there that you think we could maybe get some clarity from James on?
Yes, I would like to ask James how he thinks Victorians or Australians will feel about pastors and priests being hauled off to prison. Where have we seen this before in history? What other groups have wanted to do that? Do they want to see people of many faiths hauled off to prison? Is Australia ready for that? And is that what the people really want to see? That is one of the questions that I would like to ask him.
And I think one of the things that I'm really interested in knowing is how exactly police forces in one state are going to be able to enforce what they seem to be saying. They seem to be reaching very far in this bill. And you know why that's relevant to me is because as I have read the proposed bill in the Republic of Ireland, it's the same thing. You can't leave the state in order to procure services. If you do that, you're breaking the law. Laura, I need to just check with you.
Can I just add one thing on to that, Mike?
Sure.
In the Victorian law, I read that you cannot take someone else across I want to say state lines, but that's not the right term in Australia, for therapy. But I want to know, can someone take himself or herself outside for therapy and return?
That's a very good question. By the way, Laura, did you know that the Queen's speech in the UK this week mentioned the government's intention to ban conversion therapy? Has that kind of hit the news over there in the US? I
haven't seen it yet. I'm sad to hear it. I hope it doesn't see the light of day. We will protest it. Well, there's a lot going on, and I think the fight has only just begun. Now, I think one of the main reasons for having James Parker here today is the fact that we need to understand how this chilling effect is beginning to land in Australia. And I would love to know from his point of view exactly what that is. But before we do that, folks, I would love you to pay attention to James Parker in action. And I didn't consult with James. Maybe this is not the best example, but I just found one of many clips where he is interacting with Sky News. And I thought it was really instructive. Before James comes, just take a look at this clip.
I say this, a very simple question. What is conversion therapy?
Just on a different note, legislation in the ACT and in Queensland now makes it a criminal offence to counsel young gay people about gender. I'm paraphrasing there. I won't go into the exact legislation, but someone who's written about this who disagrees with this and says it is wrong is our next guest, James Parker, who has written in The Spectator this week about his own experiences, which I'm delighted to say I will let him tell. James Parker, welcome to Outsiders. How are you?
It's great to be with you here today, Rowan. Thank you very much indeed.
Excellent. Well, you're over there in Perth. Tell us your story quickly, just your background story and how you... Well, I'll let you tell your story.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I mean, very simply, I mean, I came out at the age of 17, the first guy to come out in high school, went to university at 18. I was the first guy to come out in my university college at that stage. We're talking back in the 80s here. And I entered into frontline gay activism, basically preaching the mantra that people are born gay and back off and, you know, stop judging us, etc. I was in a long-term gay relationship, and it was during that time, as happens in many people's relationships, I hit a few emotional hurdles. And so I just went forward for regular therapy, cognitive therapy, behavioral therapy, a bit of EMDR. And what happened is the therapists there, you know, they were very insightful, and they uncovered all sorts of different issues from my own past. There was some infantile trauma. There was the effects of being abused as a child, sexually abused as a child. There was an assault against me when I was a teenager. The effects of being exposed to pornography during my own childhood. And just a number of different things. The fact I was questioning my gender. And what happens is we went on a therapeutic journey. And it was an incredible journey where I learned to become reconciled and at peace with many issues from my past. Now, being gay wasn't a part and parcel of why I went into therapy, but I couldn't leave behind the fact that I was a gay man, and therefore this was part and parcel of who was walking into the therapy room. But what happened while I was there is I noticed over time is that this sort of gnawing eroticization towards men began to decrease. And not only did it decrease, but I stopped finding men a mystery, as I always had. And then more surprising than anything is I began to find women attractive, such to the point as I dated women, I ended up marrying a woman, and then, of course, today I'm a father. Now, I'm concerned, therefore, that we've got laws out there that are turning around and saying, well, people don't change and people can't change. I used to preach that. I was a frontline gay activist, as I've already said. And yet what's happened is basically I was lied to for a number of years. And I know hundreds of other people who've been lied to as well. So I'm very, very concerned about these very pushy, these lockdown laws, really, that we're seeing in Queensland and ACT. But this isn't about coronavirus. This is about people's life journeys.
Rita.
But James, do you think you're just bisexual, or you've just, you know, your sexual preferences have changed, and that happens to a lot of people, where they may start out straight and then they find themselves attracted to someone of their own gender. I mean, do you really think that had anything to do with the therapy, and would this legislation in any way impede that? Because the therapy you entered wasn't gay conversion therapy. And just lastly, you're not suggesting that people who are gay all have some sort of trauma in their background or anything like that, are you?
I believe that everybody should have the freedom to go into a therapeutic situation and make their own choices. The bottom line is this: people do change. I know literally hundreds of people here in Australia who've gone from being gay to straight. I know others who've gone from being straight to gay. The bottom line is this, Rita, is, are we about freedoms in this nation? Are we about people being able to make their own genuine choices? And that's what the issue is here, is we're seeing people's freedoms being taken away. In some way or other, you might say, well, maybe you're bisexual, maybe you're this, maybe I am. But am I not allowed to have the freedom to go ahead and to discover those for myself in Australia, which claims to say I should be able to have a fair go? And of course, the Australian human rights turns around and says that we are all of inherent value, and that what we believe and what we think needs to be able to be respected. My concern is this.
Are you concerned at all that this sort of therapy could be used by, say, parents who can't accept their child is gay, and then it could be damaging? That if you've got someone who actually doesn't want to themselves be in this sort of therapy, but is forced to or encouraged to by a parent, do you see any sort of harm there, or any need to restrict?
Look, I mean, whatever happened, Rita, you bring up a really good point there. And whatever happens is this, is that anybody who steps into a therapeutic situation, be they a minor or be they an adult, they should be allowed to make the therapeutic journey that they want to make. This isn't about parents pushing people. This is about training insightful therapists, as I had, to be able to help people on their therapeutic journey. Now, the issue is this: it's like you turn around saying, we've had a number of people who died in, having heart surgery, so we must stop heart surgery from taking place. Nobody must have any more heart surgery. That's just ridiculous. But what's happening in Queensland with the Anastasi, and what we're seeing in the ACT with the Gestapo under Andrew Barr, is they're turning around. These are people whose freedoms I've fought for in the past, and now they're taking away not just my freedoms, but they're taking away the freedoms of young people I'm walking with, who are now feeling suicidal, who are now having an increase of anxiety in their lives because their therapeutic choices are being taken away from them.
James.
This is not the Australia that I came to.
But, I mean, is there evidence that there's an awful lot of young gay people who are looking for therapy that might change their sexual orientation? I would have thought that people just would want therapy to affirm whatever their orientation is. This isn't, there's a difference between this therapy that you did and, these conversion programs that I think the laws are talking about, isn't there?
Well, let me say this. I'd love to know what the conversion programs are here in Australia. I mean, my feet are very firmly on the ground in this area, and I'm not seeing any conversion programs as we know it. I mean, they're talking about inducing people to vomit, ice baths, electroshock treatment, rest of it. I don't know of any of that anywhere here in Australia whatsoever. But the challenge we have is this, and this is where our legislation has to be incredibly careful, because what's happening is we have people like Stephen Miles, the Health Minister in Queensland, and Andrew Barr, the Chief Minister there in the ACT, saying you're not broken, you can't be fixed. How dare anybody turn around and say that the way you're born can be changed, etc. The bottom line is this: it's true, human sexuality is a very, very fluid journey, and people need to have the freedom to be able to nip in and out of the therapy room with insightful therapists to be able to look at this. At the moment, the door is being locked on the therapy room for anybody around to examine aspects of their human sexuality. There's plenty of affirmation of people to go from straight to gay, but what's happening now is the door's being closed and saying, well, what if somebody has got stuck and locked into an area that isn't truly them? Well, I'm very, very sorry, but you're now in lockdown for the rest of your life. That's
James Parker, fantastic. Thank you very much, James Parker. Very interesting, very insightful, and thanks for bringing that to Outsiders this morning.
Well, let's bring James Parker now with Laura, and let's continue our conversation with James. I have to ask the producers to make sure that we don't miss the clip from Martin Iles before we leave Australia. That would really be a problem if we did that. So would you please remind me? James, welcome. Lovely to see you.
It's great to be here with you. Good to have you to be here today, Mike. And to see you too as well, Dr. Laura.
Well, James, it's so nice to meet you, even if it's online. I think we may have exchanged emails at some time. I certainly have been aware of you and your work, and I'm just so appreciative and so proud of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
So, James, you've been very patient listening to us consider what's happening in Australia. Is there anything on your heart at this point that you'd like to share in terms of what you've heard this evening?
I mean, there's multiple things. And first of all, I'd love to answer some of your own questions that I've just been writing out some bullet points. The first thing is for viewers to understand is ACT is the Australian Capital Territory. I think John Steenhoff, my dear friend John, mentioned that already. It is a very, very small patch of land here in a vast, vast nation. So the very fact that the chief minister, if you like, the political head honcho of the Australian Capital Territory has brought about a law to say that people cannot leave the territory, and to leave the territory to go and get help around sexuality or gender that is not totally affirmative towards being gay or to being your non-biological gender. They say this is a criminal act. It's almost unbelievable that this should happen. And the very fact that Victoria should then turn around and not just copy that law, but to take it to a much further extreme. And that extreme is this, that there's an extraterrestrial application to that law. Now, I want to say this, is the states and the territories here in Australia, of which John mentioned there are 9 of those, we are not covered by the constitution of our nation. So in the US, what happens if a state, this state law says one thing, then federal law can sometimes override that. That is not the case here in Australia, as we've had lawyers looking at that. So the problem becomes this, Mike and Dr. Laura, is that if somebody in Victoria decides that they do want to have some help, and they contact me, or they are referred to contact me, for example, or somebody like me in another area of the nation, then that would be regarded as criminal activity. But also, if they wanted to contact you and to do something online, that is also seen to be criminal activity. And of course, the fines that they're looking at, I don't think John mentioned this, it's 200,000 Australian dollars. It's about 100,000 British pounds. I think that's probably about 1.3, 1.4, about 140, 150,000 US dollars, and also 10 years imprisonment. So it's both the fine and the imprisonment for doing that. And what happens is, it may be the person wants to be able to have the help, but what the government is saying is, sorry, but this is basically harmful to you, and it's deceitful, and it's harmful to the community at large. Now, I want to say this to you. I know several hundred people here in Australia who have moved from being homosexual much more into a fuller heterosexual identity, and the number of people who've detransitioned, having had their very healthy bodily parts mutilated in the past. And what's happened is these people are now doing much, much better in their lives. Their mental hell has now become mental health. Their depression has gone. And what's happening is they're beginning to enter into a much, much fuller life. Many of these people had no diagnosis whatsoever before going into the situations that they went into. I've heard from 2 people recently lying there on the medical bed, about to go into the surgical theatre to have their genitalia removed, 2 men. Both of them said to the nurse, I don't think I'm ready for this. And the nurse strokes their hand and says, it will all be over very soon.
Wow.
And what's happened is both of them realized afterwards that this isn't what they wanted. We're trying to find a number of people who will sue for millions of dollars. Because what's happening is somewhere down the line, there has to be somewhere's got to stop this behavior. That's one thing that concerns me. The other thing that really concerns me is this. And this is the effect on women and children, and women and girls. Because what happens is this law basically is going to demolish the dignity of women and girls. What's very interesting, Mike, for you to know is this, is possibly one of the loudest responses to this Change and Suppression Prohibition Act was from the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Alliance here in Australia. Let me repeat that. The Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Alliance wrote a 7-page document saying this law is homophobic, it is deceptive, it is unscientific, it is not necessary, and basically it's going to stop ex-gays from being able to tell their stories. Because what the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Alliance has realized is that because this is following the transgender agenda, it's going to rip down the altar that the gay men have towards masculinity, and it's going to rip down the altar that the lesbian women have to femininity, because it wants to get rid of male and female. Right. So it's the lesbians, the gays, and the bisexuals, the psychiatrists, the doctors, the safeguarding experts that have most been against this. And the politicians have not and will not listen. Mm-hmm. Something is deeply wrong in the psyche of Australia's politicians.
James,
well, Australia and the other nations as well. Sorry, Laura, go ahead.
James, I would like to communicate with that organization of the lesbians. You said it was lesbian?
LGBT Alliance. That's
the
right.
LGBT Alliance. I would like to share with them some research conducted by LGBT affirmative researchers on therapy provided by LGBT affirmative therapists and gay peer counselors, published in several peer-reviewed articles in peer-reviewed journals, using replicated, randomized, controlled trials, which found that men who have sex with men can successfully reduce their same-sex behavior they don't want, casual same-sex behavior, and retain that change at 6 months, 8 months, and 1 year follow-up. That those therapists will now be sent to jail and bankrupted.
That's right. I mean, this is what is absolutely ludicrous. And the very, very fact that the Victorian Parliament has chosen to pass these laws shows that actually this is not based on science. This isn't based on reason. And the document that Mike has mentioned a couple of times, the Preventing Harm, Promoting Justice, is actually preventing justice and promoting harm. That's exactly what's happening. And what I'm seeing here as the rubber hits the road here among fellow Australians is there are many people now in Victoria whose depression is beginning to rise again, and people who are feeling suicidal in a place where previously they weren't feeling suicidal because they've been having good, insightful therapy from people who understood what they were doing. So what's happening is this is actually now deeply, deeply damaging people who are same-sex attracted or who have gender dysphoria. It is absolutely ludicrous that this should be taking place.
I think that is such an important point, just how much harm is now going to be done because of this. But I just want to connect for a few minutes with something that Jose Ruba said last week, or the last time we were together when we were talking about Canada. I don't know if you remember this, Laura, but he spoke about, I think it's Bill C-10 that is now coming into vogue in Canada, which is about the government controlling almost exclusively the internet and material that is put up there. This seems Orwellian, without doubt.
Well, and the only way I can see that the Victorian government are going to be able to police this law is to take absolute control of the internet. They have to be able to do so. They will want to be able to, they will look, and they know already that I've written articles, for example, based on this topic. They know perfectly well that I've spoken out in Melbourne, in Sydney, and different parts of Australia, and different parts of the world about this. So what happens is the Victorian Equal Opportunities Human Rights Commission, which is in itself, it's not a police body, but it's been given police powers, as John Steenhoff mentioned, to investigate people like me, to be able to take my hard drive away from me, to come into my home and to go through every single item that I own to make sure that I am in no way whatsoever saying that people can change, even though there are literally thousands of stories out there in the world of people who have changed.
Right.
And there are people around who are constantly changing as well. They also have the opportunity to be able to re-educate people as well. So we really are seeing this sort of cultural Marxism, or what some would say are the communist goals, being literally rolled out right in front of our faces. What's particularly interesting as well is that there were a number of us here in Australia, ex-gays, ex-lesbians, ex-trans, who all spoke with 12 different politicians from the upper house in Parliament in Victoria. And we shared our stories of sexual abuse, our stories of rape, our stories of drug addiction, our stories of ex-prostitution. And they went, oh, yes, oh, my gosh, oh, this is, oh, gosh, isn't it amazing that your lives are where they are? And they totally ignored what we said. And they still went ahead and just passed the law. And a number of them said that they passed it because they're frightened of the vilification they will get from a little handful of LGBTQIAAP plus 2S ideologues. Basically, the tail is now wagging the dog. And there's also, as I said, many lesbian, gay and bisexual people and a number of trans people as well who think this is an absolutely crazy law because they're also aware that their lives are changing and one day they may want to have therapy or they may want to have prayer as well.
Mm-hmm.
James, tell us something about the church. How are churches dealing with this? Do you have any insight into that?
I do. I mean, many of the churches did wake up to this, certainly in Victoria. And what you saw was really probably the strongest coalition of not just churches, but also other faiths, with the Muslim community coming together as well.
Good.
And they put a lot of pressure onto the Victorian government not to touch this law, and not to pass this law, and certainly not to be able to mess with people's prayer lives. But once again, they ignored it. So the Presbyterian Church, God bless the Presbyterians, they have stood very firm on the ground and they've said, we are going to totally ignore this law. What we need to happen now is for really just about every single pastor in every single pulpit across Victoria and across our nation to turn around and say, well, we're going to ignore it as well. So you better build a lot more prisons and make a lot more space for a lot of pastors and a lot of people to be able to go there. And putting a few hundred pastors into a prison might mean there might be a lot of worship, and we might be able to show that actually the gospel can do good to prisoners as well. So look, people aren't losing heart here. Of course, there are those pastors and ministers and priests who basically they have thrown in the towel and they're just going with the flow, and they say we don't want to upset anybody, etc. But they don't believe the truth of the gospel, not like those of us who've been deeply impacted by the gospel and know that whatever happens is male and female, God created them, and God's design is perfect, and God's not going to rest. And I'm seeing this also at the grassroots here where I'm living. I'm seeing many people who aren't even being preached to, but literally they are experiencing the power of the Holy Spirit, and God is beginning to show them that the life that they've been leading is completely wrong. I think about one man who for 19 years lived as a false woman, and he got his children to call him mom, and he was captain of the women's soccer team. And then literally one day he found himself just visiting this ancient building in an island off Australia, and there's a small little chapel there. And he said, what am I doing in here? God, if you exist, show yourself to me. This is his story. And within 3 days, he said the veils fell from, the veils fell from her eyes, and she became aware that all along her chromosomes were XY and that she really is a him. And so he has returned back now to his natal sex and is doing brilliantly well in every single level of his life. So there's a lot of exciting stories that are coming out of this. So how the church is doing, for the most part, they're trying to stand their ground. Some aren't, but God is very much at work in this nation.
James, as we've seen in California, sometimes our enemies do the job for us we could never do.
Very, very true, Laura. Very true indeed. That's very true. And look, I think that what's happening is this has become an opportunity for lies to really come to the surface. We're doing a lot of work here in Western Australia, getting around to as many parents as possible. So parents are aware that the materials being fed to their children from the age of 3 and 4 upwards, being told that, you know, boys can be girls and girls can be boys, and you can be any one of 1,400 plus genders. Parents are beginning to wake up now to the fact that actually their right to be the primary educators of their children is being stripped away from them. So we're saying to people, fight for the kids. And we're saying to every man, you've got to fight for women and girls. And if you don't, you'll have to answer for that. So there's a lot of fights that are here and need to take place. We're just stirring the pot as much as we possibly can. But I think that, say, long term, the demise of people's lives will become so evident that these laws will have to be, they'll just have to be refuted ultimately. I think what's sad as well, and, you know, guys, I can talk a lot, and Mike knows that too well. He's known me many years. But one of the saddest things is recently, a dear friend of mine who's quite a leader in the gay community here in Australia, he contacted me about a mutual friend of ours, another gay man, who recently had his gay marriage, or what I would call a gay mirage. Forgive me for saying that, but I've been in a long-term gay relationship and long-term heterosexual, and I know they're different. But this friend of ours who recently entered into a gay marriage, he was receiving electroconvulsive therapy because his depression was so great. And he was receiving it on an ongoing basis. And that's all they could offer him. But nobody wanted to look beneath the surface as to what was going on in his life.
Yes.
He took his life 2 months ago.
No, there's
And nobody's being held accountable for the fact that if that man had had a proper diagnosis, he would still be alive today. And it's when I hear stories like that that make me passionate, along with your good selves, to keep fighting. I fight for that man's right to be able to enter in to have the therapeutic care that he needed all along that's been denied to him. And he was given the wrong care. He was given band-aids to try and heal cancer, if you like, for want of another way of putting it. And I just think if people don't wake up, we are going to see more and more tragedy.
Well, James, on that note, I think we're going to have to draw it to a close. Sorry, Laura, but I'm afraid we've come to the end here. We'll be here all night. It's been such an honor and a blessing.
Thank you.
And I appreciate the fight that you're talking about here, James. It's something that I think will inspire many people. Folks, before we leave Australia, I think we would do ourselves great service to listen to the managing director of the Australian Christian Lobby, Mr. Martin Isles. Take a listen to this, and then we'll come back and say goodbye. James, we're going to say goodbye to you now. God bless you. What is it? Past 3 a.m.? You've earned your
like
keep
that
tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
James.
God bless you all. Good to see you.
I say this, a very simple question. What is conversion therapy? It's not our term. We didn't invent it. It didn't come from any church. It didn't come from any religion. It was not invented by us. It was invented for us by someone else with an activist mindset. And it makes absolutely no sense because conversion and therapy are two radically different things. What's a conversion? Well, a conversion is the power of God for salvation to all who believe. It's the change that God brings upon a life, from death to life, from darkness to light, from sin to salvation, from self to Christ. It's that radical change that comes about by the power of the Holy Spirit in a person's life from outside of myself, from God. That's conversion. What's therapy? Something completely different. Therapy is, it's medical treatment administered by other people. It's not a theological term. It's not intelligible in any Christian worldview to have these two things smashed together. It's their term, and therefore they have defined it. And their definition is very important to understand. In fact, it's very shocking. The Victorian government's discussion paper refers to, for example, any practice that seeks to change, suppress or eliminate an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, including efforts to reduce or eliminate sexual and or romantic attractions or feelings toward individuals of the same gender, or efforts to change gender expressions. That includes self-help, religious practices, counseling, prayer, wait for it, fasting, scripture reading. It includes encouragements or teachings around abstinence and celibacy. It includes pastoral care. A report by the Human Rights Law Centre and La Trobe University, which has been heavily relied on by the Victorian government, includes themes like this in understanding what conversion therapy is. Feeling guilt or shame, or of church teachings that homosexual practice is sinful, and of teachings that encourage people not to act on their same-sex attraction. And this applies to gender expressions, not just sexual orientations. It's not just gay conversion therapy, it's also transgender conversion therapy. So it becomes conversion therapy to encourage somebody to live their biological sex. The discussion papers explicitly say that it is not conversion therapy to affirm someone in their transgender identity or affirm someone in their same-sex attraction. It is only conversion therapy to affirm someone in their biological sex, or to affirm someone in their heterosexual attraction, or to avert someone from taking the scalpel in their hand, or taking hormones or puberty blockers, or indeed to tell someone that the best thing to do is to live a celibate life, or to wait and see where things pan out in their journey of faith. And the reality is that the whole idea of LGBT conversion therapy is nothing but a dog whistle. We know, right? It plays into that sense out there that, oh yes, well of course, Christians don't like gay people and they're very, very nasty to gay people. And of course, conversion therapy, you know, average Joe thinks, oh, electric shocks, boot camps. Well, they've probably seen that movie Boy Erased, for example, and they've probably heard about this nasty stuff. And of course, churches must be doing that. But churches are not doing that. There's none of that going on in this country right now. There's no coercion, there's no boot camps, there's no institutions built around those sorts of things, there's no electric shock therapy. The only reports I've found in Australia of that kind of thing go back decades and decades, and they weren't even done by religious groups, they were done by the government. But anyway, the real problem here, the real thing these activists are trying to target is not that bad stuff. No. They are trying to target Christian theology, doctrine, and communities themselves. But God sits in the heavens and he laughs. That's Psalm chapter 2, as people rage against all that he's decreed. And I would say this, Mr. Andrews and Mr. Barr, they can try, but God will build his church. Christ will build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And their efforts to keep LGBT Australians out of the church and to hide the message of salvation from a group of people who need it will come to nothing, because you, Mr. Andrews and Mr. Barr, are picking a battle with Almighty God, and I think I already know who's going to win. That is the truth of it.
Wow. Well, that was a journey. Thank you so much once again, Laura, for your time. What's happening the next time we come together? Do you remember?
Yes, on our next broadcast, we will be addressing the so-called conversion therapy ban in Germany.
Well, that'll be great. We'll turn our attention more to this area and then also to the United Kingdom. Thank you very much, Laura. Have a good week. Don't work too hard, but continue the fight. Thank you so much for being here. Good night.
Good night.